My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Today, we are getting back to our normal format after 2 episodes with great guests. Today, it's just me. We are going to look at a poem by a very interesting figure. His name is Qiu Fengjia. We're also going to very briefly look generally at Taiwanese literature and the situation on Taiwan. I think this is going to be the first time in the history of the Chinese Literature Podcast where we are discussing a work of Taiwanese literature. Rob and I recorded an episode on Bai Xianyong. We didn't publish it because it was not good enough to make the cut. I think the sound quality was off or something. I can't actually remember. I want to say to those of y'all out there who have asked me to have more Taiwanese literature on the podcast, I've heard y'all. I'm going to try and more regularly incorporate literature from Taiwan on the podcast. There was never any ulterior motive in me not putting Taiwanese authors on the podcast. It really was just accidental. I personally have a connection with Taiwan. I studied first in China from 2006 to 2007, and then 2009 to 2010. Then in 2013, I got a scholarship to study in Taiwan from the Taiwanese government. I loved Taiwan. While I was there, I studied Taiwanese literature. I had wanted earlier to include some Taiwanese literature. It's just that for a variety of reasons, I haven't gotten a chance on the podcast to do works from Taiwan. That stops today. In the coming months, I'm teaching a course on Taiwanese literature. I will be incorporating more works from Taiwan into the podcast. Today, we are going to look at Qiu Fengjia. I hesitate to call him Taiwanese. I don't know if my friends in Taiwan would even call him Taiwanese. Let me explain why. Qiu Fengjia was born on December 26th, 1864. He died February 25th, 1912, just as the Xinhai Revolution that he helped initiate was coming to an end. He was born in what today is Miaoli County, a fairly rural county on Taiwan's west coast. He was a Hakka, that's Kejarin. For those of y'all who aren't familiar with the Hakka are a linguistic group in China and Taiwan. They kind of function as an ethnic group. If you were to ask a specialist today in China whether or not they're an ethnic group, they would say, no, absolutely not. They're part of the Han Chinese majority. Scholars in the US and Europe would probably think of them more as an ethnic group. I think it's a topic that we can debate in a different forum. Whether or not they are an ethnic group, they speak Hakka, which is distinct from Taiwanese, Taiyu, and also distinct from Mandarin. The Hakka make up about 15% of Taiwan's population. Qiu was a fairly typical literati. By the age of 6, he was able to read and write classical Chinese. By the age of 14, he had passed one of the lower-level exams put out by the central government. These are the exams that lead to wealth and power within the empire. You pass the first one, then you can pass the second one, then you can pass the third one. The third one is the big one that leads to the big bucks and the big positions in government. By the age of 26, Qiu had gone to the capital and passed that number 3, that top-level exam. He returned to Taiwan, he did some work, he helped out his family, and then Qiu became caught up in the cogs of history. In 1894, Meiji Japan and Qing China went to war. The war was largely over control of Korea and Manchuria, distant provinces of the Qing that had little to do with Taiwan. The Japanese whooped the Chinese, showing the superiority of the reforms that the Japanese had made. 50 years before 1894, the Japanese were considered by most in China to be provincial, to be some distant state that was not nearly as glorious as China. China, they thought of as the center of the world. When these British barbarians come knocking at their door, they look down on them. Who are these hairy barbarians? It turns out those hairy barbarians had something to offer. The Japanese took much of what imperialists were offering. They incorporated it into their own state, and they created the most successful state during this period of East Asian history. The war is an important turning point for Japan, but it's a major turning point in Chinese history. This war is almost as important of a crux as the 1839 to 1842 Opium War. Some might argue that, in fact, it's more important. You have Japan, a former suzerain to China. Here they are getting all uppity, trying to present themselves as equal to China, the center of the world, but that center does not hold. In 1895, China lost. Japan beat China. Many in China were rethinking everything at this point. How had China, once the center of the world, suddenly been bested by this country on the eastern edge of the Pacific Ocean? This is the point where many in Qing China found their world turned upside down, and they realized that the technological revolution brought by the barbarians from the Atlantic world had transformed Japan into an Asian power. If China wanted to survive, it would have to transform itself too, just like the Japanese had done. One of the consequences of this war, in the negotiations between Beijing and Tokyo, China gives Japan Taiwan. They just hand it to them as a part of the Treaty of Shiminoseki. That's where Qiu Fengjia comes in. Qiu Fengjia is at the time living in Taiwan, but he is one of these people who has passed the high-level exam, so he's eligible for government service. I don't think he's serving, or if he is serving at the time, it's in a fairly low-level position. And on the date the Treaty of Shimonoseki is signed, Qiu gets word that Taiwan has been given away to Japan by Qing China, and he pens this poem. Spring worries. Spring worries are hard to shake off. Pull yourself together and look to the mountains. Past events frighten the heart. Tears shed their own tears. 4 million people all have the same cry. Last year's today, Taiwan was ceded. A couple of things. This poem is talking about spring worries. That's clearly a reference to Qiu hearing the news of the Treaty of Shimonoseki. But what does he say? He says, this is hard to shake off. He seems almost optimistic at this point. There's this sense that maybe this is something that we will be able to get over. It's difficult to shake off, but maybe we will be able to shake it off. He's trying to say, look, we have to keep our cool. Even though we have heard this news that China has abandoned us, we still need to try to look to China to figure things out. The term at the end of this line, 看山, that's look to the mountain. I think that's an interesting term. In Taiwan, when you use the term mountain, it usually connotes China. So there's a common phrase to refer to China, Tangshan, the mountains of Tang, the mountains of the Tang dynasty, the Tang state, something like that. Tangshan is a way to refer to all of China in Taiwan. Here, when Qiu says, look at the mountains, I'm not certain of this. I don't have any commentary saying this is what he is actually saying. But the way I interpret this is that I think he's making a reference to China. He's saying we have to look at what is happening in China. We have to look at what is happening in the mother country. And based off what he says in the next line, worry is what he is getting from the mother country. Tears shed their own tears. There is the sense that worry, pain, it's somehow all exponential, that worry is giving birth to their own worries, that the author's mental universe is enveloped by worries. Tears are coming out of tears. It's really sad. Whereas in that first line, I think I felt like there was a sense of hope. By line number 2, that seems to have all gone to the wayside. In line 3, he mentions 4 million people who have the same cry. 4 million people is the number of people living on Taiwan at the time, so they all have the same cry. What is that cry? This last line is the most confusing in the entire poem. My translation is, last year's today, Taiwan was ceded. The Chinese original literally says, last year today, Taiwan was ceded. 去年今日各台湾. In the original Chinese, there's no clear indication as to what the relationship is between the words last year and the word today. I was relying on some other translations of this poem from classical Chinese into modern Chinese that I looked at when doing research for this episode, but I'm still confused. What's going on here? This doesn't make sense temporally. He's not talking about last year. He's writing the poem on April 17th, 1895. This is the date the Treaty of Shimonoseki is signed. So his worries are clearly about today, not last year. I really struggled with how to interpret this last line. It doesn't make sense to say last year's today, the today of last year. Those don't make any sense in Chinese. They don't make any sense in English. As I was thinking about this poem, I came to the conclusion that this line is not meant to be interpreted literally, because that does not make sense if you read it literally. But there's this sense in this poem that with the ceding of Taiwan from Qing China to Meiji Japan, there's this sense that time has been riven in two. It's been ripped apart. There's a time when Taiwan was a part of China, and then it's been ripped away. And those are the two times. And in trying to put time back together, there's the sense that things don't fit right back together. And I think that's what last year's today means. I'm not certain of that. That's very much my creative interpretation. I think that there's something to that. On the one side of this divide is the past, where Taiwan is linked to China. That is the last year. On the other side, there is the present, where Taiwan is, we don't know. This is what's referred to as today. And by juxtaposing those two time words in a way that doesn't make sense, the reader gets this sense of how discombobulated the poet is. This poem is, I think, the most fascinating poem I've found so far from Qiu Fengjia's career. It's not the only thing that Qiu Fengjia does. Qiu Fengjia would go on to try to ride the wave that is history, and eventually, like most people who surf the wave of history, he was eaten by the wave, rolled up, and drowned in the water. April 17th, 1895, the Qing officially abandons any claim to Taiwan, but sotto voce, the Qing still tries to stoke Taiwanese independence from Japan. They don't want to give Taiwan to Japan. They want to keep Taiwan independent. They both have this kind of ethnic relationship. Taiwan, at this point, most people on the island speak some form of Chinese. It's not surprising that the Qing would feel a sort of paternalistic feeling for the Taiwanese. But also just from a geopolitical standpoint, the Qing see the Japanese increasingly as their rival, and Taiwan is a space where they can compete with Meiji Japan. Now, they've given Taiwan away, but that doesn't mean they have completely abandoned the island. What the Qing did was they encouraged Qing officials still on the island of Taiwan to try and establish a democratic republic of Taiwan. Taiwan Minzhuguo. Qiu Fengjia is the vice president of the Democratic Republic of Taiwan. He becomes an official in this government. It's very short-lived. It only lasted for a couple of months. This government was little more than an attempt to fend off the Japanese and keep Taiwan connected to the Qing. They make that pretty apparent when Qiu Fengjia and the other government officials decide on the error name. That's that thing in Chinese history where Chinese officials boiled down the official ideology of that period, of that era. They boil it down to a single phrase. So all Chinese emperors have error names that will last for a few years, starting from Hamudi into the Qing dynasty. The first error name that's chosen for the Democratic Republic of Taiwan is Yongqing. That is forever Qing, part of the Qing dynasty. The new Taiwanese government that was a part of the Taiwan Minzhuguo, the Democratic Republic of Taiwan, they saw themselves as being part of the Qing dynasty, as having some connection to the Qing Chinese state. These illusions did not last for very long. The republic, like I said, lasted just a few months. The Japanese government saw what was happening, and they invaded Taiwan and took control of Taiwan, turning the island arguably into Japan's first colony. Qiu Fengjia eventually fled to China, where he was active in anti-Qing revolutionary circles. He helped overthrow the Qing government. I guess in Qiu's life, forever Qing was not really forever. What was forever was his longing for Taiwan. There's a lot of nonsense reported by Chinese nationalists today about how Taiwan and the Taiwanese never forgot their Chinese heritage. They are indelibly linked to China, the mother country. A lot of that is nonsense. There were many in Taiwan who were happy to be part of the Japanese Empire, and I am not aware of very many people in Taiwan pre-1945 who wanted to become part of China. That said, Qiu Fengjia, he was a sort of proto-Chinese nationalist. Qiu never forgot the loss of Taiwan. He actually named his son Qiu Nian Tai, that is, Qiu Remember Taiwan. Qiu Fengjia helped overthrow the Qing government. That happened October 11th, 1911, and the revolution continued for about 3 months into February 1912, just as they were finalizing the end of the Qing dynasty, the end of Imperial China. Qiu Fengjia got sick, possibly from overwork. His final words were, "Bury me facing south. I will not forget Taiwan." He did not forget Taiwan, but I don't actually know what Qiu Fengjia's status is amongst the minds of the Taiwanese people. He's born in Taiwan, but he ends his life in China, being a sort of Chinese nationalist figure, talking about reunifying Taiwan with China, which in Taiwan today, that's a very contentious perspective. So I don't actually know how the Taiwanese people think of him. Do they think of him as Taiwanese, or do they consider him Chinese nationalist? He has a university in Taiwan that is named after him, Fengjia University in Taichung. It's one of the more important science-oriented universities, but I really don't know what his status is in Taiwan. If listeners here are Taiwanese and have an understanding of what the general consensus is, I'd love it if you sent me an email. I started out with this question of whether Qiu Fengjia would be considered Taiwanese today. I think that's a good place to end this podcast. Before I go, this poem, with its sense of unforgettable sadness about something that has been lost, there's a Chengyu that I'm reminded of. 刻骨铭心. That literally means to be so unforgettable that you're going to carve it onto bone and etch it onto the heart. I think that's a great Chengyu for how we can think about a lot of things that are important in our lives. Well, that's it for me. If you liked this podcast or if you hated it, please send me an email letting me know. If you're at Fengjia University or if you're a Taiwanese listener who has some opinion on Qiu Fengjia, send me an email. That email address is ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. I love hearing from listeners, even if it takes me a while to respond. I love reading what you think about the podcast, good or bad. If you like the podcast and want to show your support, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Chinese Literature Podcast at Patreon. Check out the webpage, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. I'll put a translation of Qiu Fengjia's work, my own translation of Qiu Fengjia's work, on the page along with the original. I'm Lee Moore, and that's it for the Chinese Literature Podcast. 再见.